Her parents sold her because of infertility, until a lonely lumberjack with 4 children took her in. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls as 24-year-old Rebecca Walsh stood beside her father, her hands clasped tightly in front of her gray woolen dress. Her dark hair was braided neatly down her back, and though her posture was straight with the dignity her mother had taught her, her eyes held the quiet resignation of someone who had accepted a fate she could not change. Beside her stood her father, 48-year-old Judge Henry Walsh, a distinguished man whose silver-touched hair and formal black coat spoke of his position in their small Montana town. His weathered face carried the weight of a decision that had torn at his conscience for weeks, but economic necessity had a way of making even good men do things they never thought they would. "Remember Rebecca?" he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority he was known for in his courtroom, tempered now with something that might have been regret. "This is for the best. The Carpenter family has means, and you'll have a roof over your head and food on your table." Rebecca nodded, though the words felt hollow to both of them. At 24, she had long since accepted that her inability to bear children made her a burden, rather than a blessing in the eyes of most families. The shame her parents felt about her condition had grown heavier with each passing year, and when the Carpenters had offered to take her in as a domestic worker, in exchange for settling her father's gambling debts, it had seemed like the only solution to everyone's problems. What Rebecca didn't know was that across the street, 41-year-old Nathan Brooks was watching the exchange with growing concern. Nathan was a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark hair touched by gray at the temples and kind eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone his age. His weathered hands and simple work clothes marked him as a laborer, but there was a quiet dignity about him that commanded respect. Nathan had brought his 4 children to town for supplies, and they stood beside him now, observing the scene with the curiosity of youth. 12-year-old Sarah, his eldest, had her father's dark hair and serious brown eyes. 10-year-old Michael stood close to his father's side, while 8-year-old Emma held the hand of 5-year-old Daniel, the baby of the family who still sometimes forgot that his mother wasn't coming home. Nathan's wife, Martha, had died 2 years ago during a particularly harsh winter, leaving him to raise their 4 children alone while managing his lumber operation. The isolation of their mountain home and the demands of single parenthood had taken their toll, but Nathan had managed to create a stable, loving environment for his children, though he often worried it wasn't enough. "Papa," Sarah whispered, tugging at Nathan's sleeve, "why does that lady look so sad?" Nathan followed his daughter's gaze to where Rebecca stood, her face carefully composed but her eyes reflecting a deep sadness that reminded him of his own grief. He could see the transaction taking place, money changing hands, papers being signed, a human being treated like property to settle a debt. Something about the scene stirred a protective instinct in Nathan that he hadn't felt since Martha's death. He'd heard whispers about Judge Walsh's gambling problems and his family's recent financial troubles, but seeing Rebecca, seeing the quiet dignity with which she accepted her fate, made his chest tighten with sympathy. "Wet here," Nathan told his children, stepping forward before he could second-guess himself. Judge Walsh looked up as Nathan approached, his expression shifting to one of cautious recognition. Nathan Brooks was known in Cedar Falls as an honest, hard-working man, but he moved in different circles than the judge's family. "Judge Walsh," Nathan said respectfully, removing his hat. "I couldn't help but notice. Is Miss Walsh in need of employment?" The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm afraid that's already been arranged, Mr. Brooks. The matter is settled." Then Nathan glanced at Rebecca, noting the way her shoulders had straightened slightly at his intervention. "With respect, sir, I'm wondering if Miss Walsh might prefer a different arrangement. I have 4 children who could use a woman's guidance, and I can offer fair wages plus room and board." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, though she kept her gaze fixed on the ground as propriety demanded. The idea that someone might offer her a choice in her own fate was so foreign that she barely dared to hope. "The agreement is already made," Judge Walsh said firmly, though Nathan could hear uncertainty in his voice. "Agreements can be renegotiated," Nathan replied calmly, "especially when they involve people rather than property." The words hung in the air like a gentle rebuke, and Judge Walsh felt heat rise in his cheeks. He knew what Nathan was implying, and the truth of it stung. Rebecca finally looked up, meeting Nathan's eyes for the first time. What she saw there was something she'd almost forgotten existed. Kindness without condition, respect offered freely rather than earned through perfect behavior. "Miss Walsh," Nathan said directly to her, "would you prefer to make your own choice about your future?" The question was revolutionary. Rebecca had never been asked what she preferred about anything more significant than what to prepare for dinner. She glanced at her father, seeing the mixture of embarrassment and resignation in his expression. Rebecca began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would like very much to have a choice." Nathan smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Then you do. My children and I live in a cabin about 10 miles north of town. It's simple but comfortable, and we could use help managing the household. In return, I can offer you a fair wage, your own room, and the respect due to any member of our family." Judge Walsh looked between Nathan and Rebecca, recognizing that his daughter had just been offered something he'd never been able to give her, dignity and independence. The weight of his gambling debts still pressed on his shoulders, but seeing the hope in Rebecca's eyes made him realize that some prices were too high to pay. "The Carpenters won't be pleased," he said finally. "I'll speak with them," Nathan replied, "and I'll ensure your debts are settled fairly." As the small group made their way through the transaction that would change Rebecca's life, Nathan's children watched with interest. They had been without a mother's presence for 2 years, and while their father had done his best, they all missed the gentle guidance and nurturing care that Martha had provided. "Papa?" Emma whispered as they prepared to leave town with Rebecca sitting beside Nathan on the wagon seat. "Is she going to be our new mama?" Nathan smiled at his daughter's direct question. "Miss Rebecca is going to help us take care of our home and family. Whether she becomes something more than that, well, that's something that would have to grow naturally, if it's meant to happen at all." Rebecca heard this exchange and felt a warmth in her chest that she'd almost forgotten was possible. These children weren't seeing her as damaged goods or a burden to be endured. They were seeing her as a potential addition to their family, someone who might bring value to their lives, rather than someone whose presence needed to be tolerated. The ride to Nathan's cabin took them through some of the most beautiful country Rebecca had ever seen. Dense forests of pine and fir stretched up mountainsides, while clear streams ran alongside the wagon path. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of evergreen and wildflowers. "It's beautiful," Rebecca said softly, the first words she'd spoken since they'd left town. "Martha always said this place had a way of healing wounded souls," Nathan replied, his voice carrying the gentle sadness he always felt when mentioning his late wife. She believed that beauty and peace could cure almost anything if you gave them enough time. Rebecca nodded, understanding instinctively that Nathan was offering her something precious. Not just employment, but the chance to heal from years of feeling unwanted and inadequate. The cabin, when it came into view, was larger than Rebecca had expected. It was well built and clearly maintained with care, surrounded by a garden that showed signs of both productivity and attention to beauty. Wildflowers had been allowed to grow alongside the vegetables, and there were touches throughout that spoke of a woman's influence. Though time and the demands of survival had taken their toll on some of the more delicate details, "Mama planted those flowers," Sarah said, pointing to a patch of colorful blooms near the front porch. "Papa keeps them watered, but they're not as pretty as when she took care of them." Rebecca smiled, her first genuine smile in months. "Perhaps I could help with the garden. I've always found peace in growing things." That evening, as Nathan showed Rebecca to the small but comfortable room that would be hers, the first space that had ever belonged to her alone, she felt a sense of possibility that had been absent from her life for years. "I want to be clear about expectations," Nathan said as they stood in the doorway of her new room. "You're not a servant here, Rebecca. You're a member of this household, and your opinions and preferences matter. The children need guidance and care, and I need help managing the practical aspects of our lives. But you're not here to be anyone's property or to live up to impossible standards." Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you, Nathan. I can't tell you what it means to be treated as a person worthy of respect." Nathan's expression grew thoughtful. "Everyone is worthy of respect, Rebecca. The fact that you've been made to feel otherwise says nothing about your value and everything about the failure of others to recognize it." Over the following days, Rebecca began to understand what it meant to be part of a real family. The children were well behaved, but not unnaturally so. They had moments of disagreement and mischief, but they also showed genuine care for each other and easy affection for their father. Sarah, the eldest, took it upon herself to show Rebecca the routines of the household. "Papa does his best," she confided as they prepared breakfast together, "but he doesn't really understand about things like hair ribbons and which dress is best for Sunday service." Rebecca smiled, remembering her own childhood longing for someone who understood such details. Those things matter more than many people realize. They're part of feeling pretty and special. Michael, the only boy among the siblings, was more reserved at first, but Rebecca won him over by showing genuine interest in his collection of carved wooden animals and his dreams of becoming a trapper like his uncle. Emma was immediately affectionate, seeming to sense that Rebecca had a natural understanding of a little girl's need for stories and gentle attention. She would curl up beside Rebecca in the evenings, listening to tales that Rebecca remembered from her own childhood or sometimes just talking about her day. Daniel, the youngest, was perhaps the most immediately accepting. At 5, he was old enough to remember his mother, but young enough to be open to new sources of comfort and care. Within a week, he was climbing into Rebecca's lap for stories and reaching for her hand when they walked to the creek. Nathan watched these developing relationships with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. Rebecca brought a warmth to their home that he hadn't realized they were missing. It wasn't just the practical help, though that was certainly valuable. It was the way she listened to his children's concerns with genuine attention, the way she remembered small details about their preferences, the way she made their simple cabin feel more like a home. "She's good for them," he said to himself one evening, as he watched Rebecca help Emma with her letters, while Sarah and Michael cleaned up after dinner. "Good for all of us." But it was Rebecca's response to learning about his wife's death that truly touched Nathan's heart. When Sarah mentioned that Mama had died trying to bring them a baby brother, Rebecca's reaction was immediate and heartfelt. "Your mother must have loved you all very much," she said softly, pulling Emma closer on her lap. "And that love doesn't go away just because she's not here anymore. It lives on in all the ways your father takes care of you, and all the ways you take care of each other." Nathan, overhearing from the kitchen, felt his chest tighten with emotion. Rebecca had just given his children something he'd struggled to provide, a way to understand their loss that honored their mother's memory, while affirming the love that continued to surround them. As the weeks passed, Rebecca found herself settling into the rhythm of life at the Brooks cabin with a contentment she'd never known. Her days were full but not overwhelming, productive but not joyless. She cooked meals that brought the family together around the table each evening, mended clothes while listening to the children's chatter, and helped with lessons that kept their minds sharp and curious. But it was the small moments that meant the most of all. The way Nathan always asked for her opinion when making decisions that affected the household. The way the children included her in their games and secrets. The way she felt valued rather than merely tolerated. One evening, as she sat on the front porch mending one of Michael's shirts, while Nathan worked on repairing a harness, he broke the comfortable silence between them. "Rebecca," he said, not looking up from his work, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Your father mentioned, that is, he said you couldn't, that children weren't." Nathan struggled with the words, clearly uncomfortable discussing such an intimate subject. "That I can't have children," Rebecca finished gently. "Yes, that's true." Nathan nodded, finally looking up to meet her eyes. "I want you to know that it doesn't matter to me. Not for your value as a person, and not for your place in this family." Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes. "It mattered to my parents. It mattered to every family in town who looked at me as a failed woman." "Then they were fools," Nathan said firmly. "A woman's worth isn't measured by her ability to bear children any more than a man's worth is measured by his ability to build a house with his bare hands. We all have different gifts, different purposes. You really believe that?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it," Nathan replied. "Look at what you've brought to this family in just a few weeks. My children are happier. Our home is more peaceful and He paused, as if surprised by what he was about to say. "I feel less alone than I have since Martha died." That night, Rebecca lay in her small room thinking about Nathan's words. For the first time in her adult life, she felt valued for who she was rather than judged for what she couldn't do. The feeling was so foreign that she almost didn't trust it. But the evidence was all around her, in the way the children sought out her company, in the way Nathan treated her opinions as important, in the way she'd found purpose and joy in caring for this ready-made family. The first real test of their new family dynamic came when Rebecca fell ill with a fever that kept her bedridden for several days. She was mortified by her inability to fulfill her responsibilities, certain that Nathan would regret taking her in when she proved to be more burden than help. Instead, she discovered what it meant to be cared for by people who genuinely loved her. Nathan brought her meals and medicine, sitting by her bedside in the evenings to make sure she had everything she needed. The children took turns reading to her and bringing her small gifts, wildflowers from Emma, a carved bird from Michael, a drawing from Daniel, and constant updates on household happenings from Sarah. "You don't have to take care of me," Rebecca protested weakly when Nathan appeared with soup and fresh water. "Yes, I do," Nathan replied simply, "not because it's an obligation, but because it's what family does. You've taken care of all of us. Now it's our turn to take care of you." The word family hung in the air between them, and Rebecca realized that somewhere in the past few months, that's exactly what they'd become. Not through blood or marriage, but through choice and daily acts of love and care. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to change colors that painted the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds, Rebecca found herself thinking more and more about the future. The arrangement with Nathan had originally been presented as temporary employment, but neither of them had mentioned an end date in months. The question of permanence was settled one crisp October evening when Daniel crawled into Rebecca's lap during their usual after-dinner time on the porch. "Rebecca," he said in the serious way that only 5-year-olds could manage, "are you going to be our mama now?" The question silenced the usual evening chatter, and Rebecca became aware that all the children were watching her expectantly. Even Nathan had stopped his whittling to listen for her answer. Rebecca began, then looked at Nathan, seeking guidance about how to handle such a loaded question. Nathan set down his work and moved closer to where Rebecca sat with Daniel on her lap, and the other children gathered around her chair. "That's something we should all talk about together," he said gently, "because families make important decisions together." Sarah, ever practical despite her 12 years, spoke first. "We all love Rebecca and she loves us. Isn't that what makes a family? She takes better care of us than Mrs. Henderson ever did," Michael added, referring to the housekeeper who had helped them briefly after Martha's death. Emma nodded vigorously. "And she knows how to braid hair and make stories exciting." Daniel, still sitting on Rebecca's lap, tilted his head back to look at her with complete trust. "You feel like mama to me." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. These children, who had every reason to protect their hearts from further loss, had opened themselves to loving her completely. "I would be honored to be your mama," she said softly, "if your father thinks that would be best for all of us." And Nathan moved to kneel beside Rebecca's chair, taking her free hand in both of his. "Rebecca, these past months have shown me that love comes in many forms. I loved Martha with all my heart, and I always will. But I've come to love you too, in a different but equally profound way." He paused, gathering his thoughts and his courage. "You've made our house a home again. You've given my children the mother's love they needed and given me partnership I never expected to find again. If you'll have us, if you'll have me, I'd like to make this family official." Rebecca looked around at the faces surrounding her. Nathan's earnest brown eyes, Sarah's hopeful smile, Michael's shy grin, Emma's excited bouncing, and Daniel's sleepy contentment in her arms. This was what family looked like, she realized. Not perfection but love. Not obligation but choice. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes. I want to be part of this family forever." The children erupted in cheers, and Nathan leaned forward to kiss Rebecca's forehead gently, a promise of the deeper affection that would grow between them in the years to come. They were married on a snowy December morning in the small church in Cedar Falls, surrounded by the townspeople who had come to respect the Brooks family and their unusual but beautiful love story. Rebecca wore a simple blue dress that Sarah had helped her choose, and Nathan wore his best suit with a wildflower boutonniere that Emma had insisted would bring them luck. Judge Walsh, Rebecca's father, attended the ceremony with a mixture of pride and shame. He had come to understand that in selling his daughter to settle his debts, he had nearly robbed her of the happiness she'd found with Nathan and the children. His brief speech at the reception was an apology disguised as a toast, asking forgiveness for failing to see his daughter's true worth. Rebecca forgave him publicly and privately, understanding that people sometimes make terrible decisions when they're desperate, and that redemption comes through acknowledgement of those mistakes, rather than through perfect behavior. As the years passed, the Brooks family became known throughout the territory as an example of what love could build when it was based on choice rather than convenience. Rebecca never did bear children of her own, but she raised Nathan's four with such devotion and wisdom that they grew into adults who carried her lessons about kindness and acceptance into their own families. Sarah became a teacher, inspired by Rebecca's patient guidance and belief in the power of education. Michael followed his dreams and became a successful trapper and guide, always returning home with stories for the family he credited with teaching him that strength came from love rather than independence. Emma grew into a young woman who combined her natural cheerfulness with the emotional intelligence Rebecca had nurtured, becoming a beloved member of the community and eventually a mother who passed on Rebecca's lessons about unconditional love. Daniel, who had no memory of life before Rebecca, grew up believing that families were supposed to be built on choice and mutual care. He became a minister, dedicating his life to helping others understand that love creates bonds stronger than blood. Nathan and Rebecca's marriage deepened over the years into a partnership that demonstrated the difference between settling for someone and choosing someone. They worked together to expand Nathan's lumber business, with Rebecca's careful attention to detail and natural business sense complementing Nathan's skill and reputation for honest dealing. On quiet evenings, when the children were grown and visiting with their own families, Nathan and Rebecca would sit on the same porch where their family had been formed, marveling at the path that had brought them together. "Do you ever regret it?" Nathan asked one such evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Leaving your old life behind, taking on a ready-made family." Rebecca smiled, the same gentle smile that had first won at children's hearts. "How can I regret the greatest blessing of my life? Your children taught me that families aren't about blood or even about perfection. They're about people who choose to love each other through whatever comes." "And your parents? Do you think they understand now what they almost cost you?" Rebecca considered the question thoughtfully. Over the years, her relationship with her parents had slowly healed, though it had never returned to what it was before they tried to sell her to settle their debts. "I think they understand that they measured my worth by the wrong standard," she said finally. "But I also think that experience taught me something important about forgiveness. People make mistakes when they're desperate or scared. The real measure of character is whether they learn from those mistakes." Nathan nodded, reaching for her hand in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "You taught all of us about forgiveness, Rebecca, about second chances and the courage to love again after loss." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd started as an unwanted daughter, sold to pay her father's debts, but she'd ended up as the chosen mother of 4 children, who had needed her as much as she'd needed them. The painful truth of her infertility had never changed, but its meaning had been transformed completely. Instead of making her worthless, it had made her available to love children who weren't born to her, but who became hers through daily acts of care and devotion. "Nathan," she said softly, "do you think Martha would approve of what we built together?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "I think Martha loved our children enough to want them to be happy and loved, even if that love came from someone other than her. And I think she would have recognized in you the same spirit of generosity and kindness that made her so special." "I hope so. I've always tried to honor her memory rather than replace it." "You have," Nathan assured her. "You've shown our children that love multiplies rather than divides, that there's room in a heart for all kinds of love without any of it being diminished." The years later, when Rebecca was in her 70s, and surrounded by grandchildren who called her Grandma Rebecca, with the same affection they showed their blood relatives, she would often think about that day in Cedar Falls, when Nathan had offered her a choice about her own future. She'd learned that the cruelest thing you could do to a person was to tell them they had no value, and the kindest thing you could do was to show them they were wrong. Nathan and his children had shown her that worth wasn't measured by what you could produce or provide, but by the love you gave and received freely. The story of the Brooks family became a legend in Cedar Falls and the surrounding territory, passed down through generations as an example of what could happen when people chose kindness over judgment, love over fear. Children would hear about the woman who couldn't have babies but became a mother to 4, and the man who lost his wife but found love again in the most unexpected place. And always, the lesson was the same, that families are built by choice and sustained by love, that healing is possible even after the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the greatest sorrows. Rebecca's inability to bear children, which had once seemed like a curse that made her worthless, had actually been the very thing that made her available to love Nathan's children with the fierce, protective devotion of someone who understood how precious and fragile family bonds could be. In the end, she hadn't been sold because of her infertility. She'd been freed because of it. Freed to find her true purpose as the mother who chose her children and the wife who chose her husband, building a family that was stronger than blood because it was founded on the unshakable bedrock of deliberate, daily love.